I still cannot get used to the early autumn twilight in our little town, especially when the cold wind starts chasing yellow and crimson leaves along the empty streets and the sun barely clings to the treetops. It seems that not long ago there was a bright September, and now the season of pumpkin pies, family dinners, and fragrant cider is in full swing. Here in Massachusetts, autumn always feels more acute. The air is as clear as crystal, and deep down you begin to reflect on the years that have passed. That evening, I returned home from yet another business trip. In my 52 years, I still occasionally have to travel for several hours to meet clients. I work as a sales consultant for a small company, and most of the time remote work is enough for me. But sometimes the boss demands personal involvement. My spirit always soothes when I finally step onto the wooden porch of my own house. From there, I can see a quiet street, and on the other side there's a spacious backyard where we once held large picnics with friends. But people grow up, and everyone has their own concerns. I don't know why, but in that moment a slight melancholy suddenly washed over me. I tossed my jacket onto a chair in the hallway, retrieved a warm blanket from the closet, and draped it over my shoulders. I took a cup of my favorite herbal mint tea. Yes, not the most popular drink in America, where everyone is obsessed with coffee, but it was important for me to feel enveloped by calm. I turned on the floor lamp in the living room, its diffused light softly bathing the room, and at that moment, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of my best friend, Hannah. Hannah and I studied together at university in Boston. We endured crazy years when, on weekends, we rarely stayed in the dorms because we would roam the neighboring states in her boyfriend's old car. In time, everyone went their own way. I stayed in Massachusetts, bought this house about 15 years ago, and she moved to New Hampshire. Now we see each other rather rarely, but the bond between us seemed never to have been lost. It was no wonder that I felt a premonition when I saw her call. Usually we exchange text messages rather than speaking on the phone. "Hi," I said, trying to keep any hint of anxiety out of my voice. "How's New Hampshire? Still as quiet as ever?" "Hey, Becky," came her voice, laced with tension. "Sorry for calling so suddenly. I need a small favor." I bit my lip. A small favor from Hannah could mean anything, from asking me to take care of a dog for a week to giving someone a ride to the airport in the middle of the night. "I'm listening," I said, attempting a smile. Even though she couldn't see me, I hoped that my smile would soften the tone. "It's about Colton," Hannah continued. "He's stranded on a country road. His car's giving him trouble. And I went out of state for a couple of days and just can't tear myself away. I'm not myself. I've been worrying all evening. Colton, her son, is no longer that little boy who used to run around our yard while we grilled steaks. He is 19 now. The last time I saw him in the spring at his birthday, I realized how much he had grown. Tall, statuesque, yet a bit clumsy in his movements, much like all young men in that transitional phase between school and true adulthood. They grow up quickly, and you don't always notice exactly when they cease to be children. "Of course, Hannah," I replied, taking a sip of my cooling tea. "Tell me what happened and where he is." "He says he's got a flat tire, or something like that," Hannah gulped. "I'm not exactly sure. He isn't really certain himself. I sent you his geolocation. It looks like he's somewhere on the outskirts of town, near an old railway branch." I rummaged through my memory. Yes, there is an abandoned road there that hasn't been used for about 50 years. Nearby stretches a field zone, a strip of woods, and beyond that, some farms. In the evenings, it's completely deserted. A shiver of uneasy premonition ran through me, and I pulled the blanket higher around my neck. "Got it. I'll check it out right away," I replied. "As soon as I'm ready, I'll go see him. I'll get in touch with you once everything's sorted." "Thank you," Hannah's voice softened. "I knew I could count on you. Tell Colton not to panic. He doesn't show it on his face, but I know how nervous he can get." I frowned, picturing him standing by the hood of his car, trying to figure out what went wrong. I remembered how my father once taught me to change the oil, clean the spark plugs, and put on the spare when the tire was flat. "Everyone should know how their car works," he used to say, tapping on the bumper. It seems we all forgot to pass on those lessons to Colton in time. After saying goodbye to Hannah, I tossed my phone onto the sofa, looked at the clock, and sighed. It was already 7 in the evening, yet outside it had grown completely dark. I went into the bedroom, changed into jeans and a sweater, some protection against the October chill, and put on my coat. Glancing briefly at my reflection in the mirror, I noticed I looked tired. Slight dark circles under my eyes, hair sticking out in all directions. But there was no time to fix my appearance. Straightening my shoulders, I reminded myself that Colton, after all, is almost a grown man, even if his life experience isn't extensive. Leaving the house, I paused for a moment on the porch. In the neighbor's yard, someone had already put up a huge inflatable pumpkin, preparing for Halloween. Somewhere beyond the houses, the wind was moaning. I felt a curious cocktail of anxiety and determination rising within me. Worry for Colton and resolve to act swiftly and confidently. It had happened before, when Hannah got herself into some trouble and I came to the rescue. But this time, everything felt slightly tenser. I got into my car and turned on the GPS, which directed me straight to his location. As I focused on the road, I couldn't help but think that this evening would be a turning point. We rarely see Colton, yet I still consider him like family. A nearly godchild figure, if you look deep into the long-standing friendship I share with Hannah. I recalled how, at 9 years old, he used to play passionately in the backyard with my old dog, building leaf castles and babbling humorously about cartoons. And now he's an adult, able to buy his own beer. In some states, not until 21, but that doesn't change the essence. Start serious relationships, look for a job, and build his own life. At the thought that Colton is no longer that little boy, I suddenly felt a pang of bittersweet longing. Time passing always makes its presence known in the most unexpected ways. "All right," I said aloud as I steered onto the country road. "The main thing is that he's okay." The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet asphalt, the shoulder with dry tufts of grass, and a worn stop sign that desperately needed replacing. The further I drove away from the lit streets, the stronger the feeling grew that something more awaited me than just helping with a flat tire. There was something in that evening that carried an air of change and premonition, making my heart tighten more than usual. I drove deeper into the dark, and soon the silhouette of a familiar silver car appeared ahead. Apparently, Colton was standing by his hood, lit by the feeble beam of a flashlight. In that very moment, I realized that this encounter would turn my orderly life upside down. But at that time, I had not yet understood just how profoundly. I braked to avoid dazzling Colton with my headlights, and then I turned off the engine just a few yards from his silver car. The darkness around was almost tangible, as if, without the headlights, sky and earth merged into one. A light drizzle, like silver dust, danced in the beam of the headlights, and the wind rustled through the branches of solitary trees along the roadside. I saw the figure of Colton standing, leaning against his car door while holding a phone to his ear. When I opened my door and stepped out, he waved, indicating that he had seen me. "Hey, Miss Becky!" Colton's voice trembled slightly, and I wasn't sure whether it was from the cool autumn wind or from nerves. "Thank you for coming. Please, just call me Becky. How many times must I say I don't like Miss?" I replied with a smirk as I approached. "Are you okay? Hannah said you were stranded here with a flat tire." He straightened up and adjusted the hood of his hoodie, which had already gotten damp from the drizzle. Colton looked even taller than I remembered from spring when I last saw him, and his angular movements gave him a particularly youthful clumsiness. Yet in his eyes there was the worry of an adult who knew he had to take responsibility for his decisions. "Yeah," he said, glancing at the rear tire. "I hit a curb or something like that. I heard a strange sound and then felt the car start to float. I stopped and looked. The tire is almost completely flat. I decided to call my mom, but she's far away and I've never changed a tire by myself. Honestly, I don't even know where the spare is in this car." I shone my flashlight on the road to inspect the damage. It was no surprise he felt the car floating. The tire was not just deflated, it was cut on the side. Apparently, he either hit something sharp or struck a broken piece of the curb. "Got it. Let's see what we can do," I said, careful not to sound too sympathetic. Young men of his age usually dislike being treated with pity. They want to feel grown up. "Are you sure you want to drive on the spare? You'll have to buy a new tire later." "Yeah, I understand, but I just want to get out of here." He shrugged, then added more softly, "Mom said you might be able to help me faster than an ambulance." I nodded. As I ran my hand through my hair, I felt tiny raindrops. It seemed the weather was finally turning bad. It would have been worse if it were pouring, but as long as it was just a drizzle, we could manage. All right, I said, lowering myself next to the trunk to help Colton open it. First, let's find the jack, the lug wrench, and the spare. And you check. Maybe there's an instruction manual in the trunk. Cars have different secret compartments for tools. Colton began rummaging in the trunk, carefully shifting empty soda bottles and scattered magazines. Finally, we found a small set of tools in the side compartment and tucked under a mat, the donut spare tire, which would hardly last a long trip, but at least would get him to town. I found it, he said, and for the first time that evening, a note of relief appeared in his voice. I hope I don't break anything. You won't, don't worry, I smiled, recalling how I felt at his age when I first took the wheel. It's simpler than it seems. Now I'll show you. Together we took out the jack, and I tried my best to explain the process clearly. First, you slightly loosen the lug nuts, then lift the car with the jack, and finally remove the tire. He listened intently, biting his lip in concentration. It even seemed to me that he was more nervous than if he were taking an exam. All right, now turn it like this. I demonstrated how to push the jack's lever. Make sure it doesn't slip, or else the car might fall. Colton nodded and began turning the knob. Slowly, the car started to rise. I remembered learning these tricks long ago, back before I began working after college. My father used to say, girls must know how to be independent too, and now those lessons were coming in handy. Do you do this often, Becky? Colton couldn't help but ask after we removed the damaged tire. I mean, you handle this so calmly, I suppose you've changed a tire many times? Well, a couple of times, I admitted, diverting my gaze as raindrops pelted us. Once I even got stranded on the highway in the middle of the night and had to figure it all out myself. I realized either I wait for an ambulance for 3 hours or I learn to do it on my own. And weren't you scared? It's pretty daunting to be alone at night. A little, yes, I confessed. But sometimes fear isn't a reason to stop. Life forces you to learn. Colton fell silent as he secured the spare. I helped him put it on, reminding him to initially tighten the lug nuts by hand. His hands trembled, perhaps from the cold or the tension. After a minute, we wiped our fingers on a cloth I pulled from my pocket and began tightening the bolts in a crisscross pattern. All done, he exhaled when we lowered the car back to the ground. But this isn't permanent, right? You can't really go far on this donut. I think it'll be enough to get you to the nearest tire shop, I replied, grateful that the rain hadn't intensified. But by then, they'll all be closed. You'll have to go there in the morning. Colton nodded, carefully avoiding my gaze. I sensed his hesitation, as if he wasn't sure what he wanted next. After a few moments of silence, I asked, So, are you planning to go home? Or do you have other plans? To my surprise, a look of confusion crossed his face. He ran a hand through his tousled hair. I don't know. Mom has the keys to our apartment, and there's no one home now. I thought I could fix this car and go back, but something didn't work out. Honestly, I just don't want to go back. That moment reminded me of conversations with other 19-year-olds who felt lost about their future. Suddenly, I felt that he was very lonely. Perhaps Hannah really is always on the road and he simply lacks someone by his side who understands him. If you don't want to go home, I began cautiously, you can come over to my place. I have an extra guest room, and it's only about 20 minutes from my street, plenty of time before the rain gets heavier, and in the morning we can take your car to the service center. Either you get a new tire or something else. Colton looked up at me. In the light of the flashlight we used to illuminate the road, his face was half in shadow, but deep in his eyes I felt gratitude. Are you sure I wouldn't be in the way? He asked, raising his eyebrows. I understand you're probably tired after work. Absolutely sure, I interrupted. Let's use you instead of formalities, okay? I have plenty of free days now. I work remotely. I'd be glad to have the company. I'm alone in this house. Sometimes there's no one to talk to. At that moment, it seemed Colton was suddenly flustered, and I felt strange emotions stirring inside me. I saw before me a young man who had unexpectedly grown up, yet remained vulnerable. Perhaps I felt the familiar warmth I had always associated with him as the son of my best friend. But at the same time, I realized that before me was no longer a child, but someone with his own adult experiences and inner world. "Thank you, Becky," he finally said. "Really, I appreciate it." His words were soft, barely audible, like the rustle of footsteps on wet leaves. I averted my gaze to hide my own awkwardness and then suggested, "Let's go. I'll drive ahead and you follow. If anything happens with the spare, I'll be right here." We gathered our tools, placed the torn tire in the trunk, and Colton hurriedly got behind the wheel of his car. I stepped back onto the road, glancing briefly at the dark horizon where not a single light was visible. The city began about 15 miles away, yet it seemed so distant and unreal. Deep down, I felt a premonition of change, as if someone had nudged me from behind and whispered, "Watch what happens next." I tried to shake off the anxiety, returned to my car, and turned on the headlights. As we drove along the deserted highway, I saw the wavering beam of Colton's headlights in my rearview mirror. He kept his distance, making sure not to lose sight of me. I intentionally did not speed. There were few traffic lights on that road, and the traffic was minimal at that hour, perhaps only an occasional truck carrying farm produce. Through the window, I caught glimpses of muted silhouettes of old wooden houses along the road. Perhaps someone had already put up Halloween decorations, or maybe preparations were underway for the next school football game. We arrived on my street after about 20 minutes. Small houses with neatly kept lawns, adorned with autumn wreaths on their doors. This was my familiar, quiet corner of Massachusetts. Behind the neighboring fences, a majestic maple stood, shedding its final leaves. I parked my car in my driveway. Colton parked right behind me. After turning off the engine, I suddenly felt the weariness of the day overwhelm me, but along with it came a strange exhilaration. After all, I wasn't used to having someone else in my home late in the evening. "We've arrived," I said with a smile as I stepped out of my car. "You're not too tired, are you?" "Not really, I'm fine," Colton said as he turned off his engine and stepped out, shivering slightly. "The main thing is the tire didn't come off." Outside, the wind was picking up, and I motioned for him to come inside quickly. When we entered the foyer, I turned on a lamp whose warm glow made the corners of the room look much cozier. The lingering scent of a spiced candle, which I had lit in the morning, still filled the air. "Take off your jacket and come in," I offered, pointing toward the coat rack. "I think we should have a little snack. Tea? Coffee?" "If I'm honest, I'm hungry," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "I haven't really eaten anything substantial all day." I went to the kitchen, found a pot of soup I had made the day before, and set it on the stove to warm up. Meanwhile, Colton timidly made his way to the living room. I became curious about what he thought of this house. After all, he'd been here as a child, but now, with his height and newfound maturity, he probably viewed the space very differently. The house was quiet, with only the ticking of the wall clock counting the minutes, and my heart tightened with a mysterious anticipation. I could hear him shifting his weight in the living room. After a few seconds, he peeked into the kitchen. "Can I help with anything?" "I don't think you need to help much here. Perhaps you could get the plates from that cupboard," I said, pointing to the top shelf. "I can't quite reach them without a stool, and you seem capable." He smiled with a bit more confidence and approached the cupboard. As he reached for the top shelf, I couldn't help but notice how grown up he had become. Broad shoulders, tense under the fabric of his hoodie, and distinctly masculine features. The same Colton who once pushed my old Labrador in a baby carriage for giggles now looked entirely different. When he turned back to me with the plates, his gaze carried a hint of gratitude, and something else, something elusive that sent a slight shiver through me, as if the room had suddenly become a couple of degrees cooler. "Thank you," I said as I took the plates. "How about some hot soup? It's not gourmet, but I hope you'll like it." "I'm sure I will," Colton nodded, his voice now carrying a bit more warmth. "Right now, it's the best food in the world to me." We served the soup into bowls and moved to the dining area, a small space by the window with a round wooden table. In the old days, my friends used to gather here often, chatting about this and that, laughing. In recent months, I had mostly been alone, reading the evening news on my tablet or immersing myself in work reports. I noticed how Colton cautiously glanced at my decorations, the photographs on the wall of Hannah and me when we were young with our diplomas in hand, and another snapshot of us laughing in a roadside cafe somewhere near the bay. His gaze seemed to gently caress the surroundings, as if trying to understand who I had become over the years. "You're already home, aren't you?" he said quietly after several spoonfuls of soup. "Sorry, sometimes I don't understand what you do. Mom mentioned you work as a consultant, but I work in sales remotely," I explained as I leaned on the table and adjusted the sleeves of my sweater. "I used to travel a lot when business was booming. In recent years, I decided to slow things down." "I see," he said, setting his spoon aside for a moment. "Sorry if I disturbed you today. I just didn't know who else to turn to." "I'm actually glad I could help," I admitted. "For me, it's a reminder that I still have something useful to offer." Colton frowned for a moment, as if not understanding why I felt the need to affirm my own usefulness. But he didn't argue, just nodded and continued eating. In the ensuing silence, I listened to the sounds of the kitchen, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and the sighing of the wind outside the windows. It seemed as if that silence thickened between us, laden with unspoken thoughts. Finally, when we were almost finished and I was clearing the plates into the sink, Colton stood and approached me as if he had something important to ask. I turned and saw on his face a mixture of uncertainty and gratitude. "Becky, would you, well, are you really okay if I stay over tonight? I know it might be a bit too much, but of course I don't mind at all," I said softly with a gentle smile. "You can sleep on the sofa in the living room. There's a blanket there. In the morning, we'll take your car to the service center and decide what to do next." He nodded, and in that moment I felt just how tired he was, as if an invisible burden had weighed down his entire day. Sighing, I reminded myself, the key is to maintain distance, not to hinder his sense of freedom. After all, he's no longer a child, yet he still needs the support of an adult he can truly rely on. "Thank you," he added quietly, "and sorry if I'm causing any trouble." "Not at all," I reassured him, careful not to reveal my own awkwardness. "Everything's fine." We were about to part ways, he to the living room, me to the bedroom, when I suddenly noticed how much he was shivering. He looked as though his chilled body couldn't warm up even indoors. "Wait, I'll turn on the fireplace," I said, breaking the brief silence. "I have an electric fireplace in the living room. It's not a real fire, but it gives off a cozy, warm glow." I flicked the switch, and a soft orange glow of electric flames burst forth from the fireplace, immediately radiating a gentle, dry heat. Colton sat on the sofa and stretched his hands toward the imaginary fire, as if trying to warm up. I stood by for a moment, noting how the warm light played on his face, accentuating the shadows beautifully. In his eyes, I caught the flicker of the simulated flames, and in that instant I realized that this night was already beginning to change something in our dynamic. We were no longer merely aunt and godson by the old arrangement. We both felt a more subtle connection that transcended the role we were used to playing. "You should go get some rest," he said, forcing a small smile. "I'll be fine here." "If you need anything, just knock on my door," I replied, catching his gaze. "Good night, Colton." "Good night, Becky." I turned and walked into the hallway, feeling as if a bundle of mixed emotions, joy, anxiety, and undercurrent of excitement, was twisting inside me. Closing the bedroom door behind me, I leaned against it and stood in the dark for a long moment, listening to my own breathing and the sound of rain tapping outside. Inside, a thought was growing. Just yesterday, I had said, "Just for a day, until your car is fixed." But now I realized that the time Colton spent in my house had changed me. And if I were to be honest, I no longer wanted him to leave. Yet I couldn't call it right. Thus ended our fourth evening together, a time of uncertainty and an unspoken longing between us that we stubbornly refused to name aloud. And I already understood that tomorrow everything might change once Colton regained his freedom on wheels and found himself at a crossroads, to leave this home or to stay, accepting all the risks and possible consequences. The entire next day passed in anxious anticipation of a call from the mechanic to let us know if Colton's car was ready. We both tried to act normally. He helped me with household chores while I prepared lunch and simultaneously answered work emails. But the tension in the air was palpable. Each of us found it difficult to focus on routine tasks, for in the past 24 hours, we had not spoken frankly about what was unfolding between us. By evening, I went to my room to check the latest reports, and then Colton's phone rang in the hallway. In the changed tone of his voice, I realized that on the other end was Hannah, his mother, and incidentally, my best friend. My heart clenched painfully. Here it was, the beginning of that very chain reaction we had feared. I heard him trying to keep calm. "Yes, Mom, I'm fine. Yes, I'm with Becky. No, it's nothing serious, just some trouble with the car." But in his brief, halting responses, it was clear that Hannah already suspected something, or at least was worried. When Colton ended the call and came to me, I noticed a mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. He sat down at the edge of a chair, fingers interlaced. "Mom will be back tomorrow afternoon. It seems she isn't pleased that I've been with you for several days already. She says the neighbors saw us together and started asking questions." "Understood," I said softly, moving my laptop aside. A chill ran through me, though I had expected something like this. "That means we'll have to explain ourselves." Colton closed his eyes, rubbing his temple. "Mom didn't yell, but I know her tone. She senses that I'm hiding something, and maybe she doesn't yet know what exactly, but—" "Don't go on, I understand," I interjected, rising from the table. My legs trembled slightly, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "I can't lie to her, Colton. She's someone very dear to me, and if there's something more between us, we can't pretend that everything is as it used to be." He suddenly stood up, and our eyes met. For a moment it felt as if the small room had become too cramped, the air too scarce. I felt my heart pounding in my temples as I realized that over these days we had gone too far to simply turn back, and that behind it all stood a real person, Hannah, whom I had known since our university days. "I don't want to hurt you," he finally said in a low voice, his tone blending desperation with tenderness. "But I also don't want to give up. I'm terrified that Mom will give you an ultimatum or even forbid us from seeing each other. If she really does decide to forbid something, then we'll have to accept it," I replied, calmer than I felt. "We're not children. We're responsible for our own actions. But I worry for your future, Colton. If things go sour with your mom, you might regret it." He shook his head and looked down. "And what about you? Won't you regret it?" For several long seconds I remained silent, weighing all the possibilities in my mind. I recalled the quiet evenings on the couch, the shared breakfasts, and those moments when our eyes said more than words. I realized that I did not regret any conversation or touch. Yet I also understood that life isn't simple, especially when long-established boundaries begin to crumble. "I don't know," I admitted honestly as I moved closer to him. "Tomorrow we'll see Hannah, and we'll see what she says. It's important not to lie to her or run away." We fell silent, letting our words dissolve into the rhythmic tapping of rain on the window. In that silence, I understood that before us was not just a choice between the past and the present, but a chance to rethink what it means to love and be loved without fear of judgment. "Perhaps," I continued quietly, meeting Colton's gaze, "we need time to think everything through. But if we decide to go further together, we must be prepared for everything. I'm willing to take that risk if you are. And I'm sure that, even though it will hurt, Hannah will understand that we are sincere." Colton nodded, his voice trembling as he said, "I choose to be with you. I choose to try to find a compromise, even if it means facing my deepest fears. I don't know what will happen next, but I don't want to lose this chance to be happy." We both knew that this choice wouldn't change the world, but it would change us. The decision made in the quiet of that rainy morning marked the beginning of a new chapter. There were no guarantees, no magical recipe for happiness, but in our hearts an ember of hope and determination to move forward, despite all difficulties, had been lit. Outside, the rain began to subside, and as if nature itself confirmed our decision, the first rays of sunlight cautiously broke through the clouds. We understood that challenges, moments of doubt, and tough conversations lay ahead. But that day had become the starting point when we, choosing not to hide our feelings, made the decision to walk together on a path toward an unknown future, one in which every step would be filled with both the pain of loss and the joy of discovery. We stood up, and as we reached out our hands to each other, we silently promised to fight for what we felt. It was the beginning of a new life, a life in which love, despite all prohibitions and fears, could become the guiding star lighting our way through the darkness.